May 1945. On the blood-soaked cliffs of Okinawa, amid the smoke, the screams and the rain of steel, a single unarmed man crawled through the chaos, carrying the wounded on his back one by one. His uniform was torn. His hands were blistered raw. And yet with each man he lowered down the escarpment, he whispered the same prayer, "Lord, please help me get one more." That man was Desmond Thomas Doss, the only American soldier in World War II who went into battle without a weapon and walked out a hero. Desmond Doss was born on February 7, 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia. He was the son of a carpenter raised during the Great Depression. His childhood was simple church on Saturdays, work during the week, and long afternoons wandering the hills with his brothers. But the Doss household carried shadows. His father William was a veteran of the First World War. The war had left him with nightmares and a bottle that rarely left his hand. Desmond grew up watching what violence could do to a man's soul. One night, during an argument, his father nearly shot a family member in a drunken rage. That moment, a single heartbeat of fear marked Desmond forever. From that night on, he vowed never to take a life. His faith as a Seventh-day Adventist only deepened that conviction. He read the Bible daily, and one verse became his compass, "Thou shalt not kill." He believed those words weren't just a commandment, they were a promise, and he intended to keep it. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America roared to arms. Desmond wanted to serve too, but on his terms. He enlisted as a combat medic, vowing to save life, not take it. At training camp in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, his beliefs made him a target. His fellow soldiers mocked him, spat on him, called him a coward. They threw their boots at him while he prayed at night. One officer even tried to have him discharged for mental weakness. Another threatened to court-martial him for refusing to carry a rifle. But Doss never broke. He didn't fight back. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "While everyone else is taking life, I'll be saving it." Over time, his quiet strength began to change people's minds. When the platoon needed medical help during exercises, Doss was always there first, calm, precise, fearless. Even those who hated him began to trust him. By the time they shipped out to the Pacific, the men had stopped calling him a coward. They started calling him Doc. Desmond Doss served with the 77th Infantry Division, the Statue of Liberty Division. Their first stop was Guam, then Leyte, and finally the last bloodiest campaign, Okinawa. Okinawa was the key to Japan's doorstep, a fortress of cliffs, caves, and tunnels, defended by more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers ready to fight to the death. For Doss and his unit, the heart of the island was a sheer cliff 400 feet high, a place the soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge. To climb it meant climbing into hell itself. On April 29, 1945, the 77th Division began their assault. The men scaled the cargo nets up the face of the cliff, emerging onto a plateau under a storm of machine gun fire. Mortars screamed, flamethrowers roared, men fell by the dozens. Within minutes, the battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Doss moved among the fallen, ignoring bullets that snapped past his ears. He crawled through smoke and blood, bandaging wounds, dragging men back to cover. When he ran out of morphine, he tore his own shirt into bandages. When his hands bled, he kept going. For 2 days, he saved lives without rest. But on the third day, the Americans were forced to retreat down the cliff. Hundreds of wounded were left stranded on top. As night fell and the shooting died down, the ridge was silent, except for the moans of dying men. And then, movement. A single figure crawled out of the dark, carrying a man on his shoulders. He lowered him by a rope to safety, then turned back into the fire. That night, Doss worked alone for 12 hours straight. He found the wounded by listening for their cries. He dragged them across the mud, patched their wounds, and prayed for strength. Each time he reached the edge, he tied a rope around the man's body and lowered him down one by one. Some were friends. Some were men who had mocked him in training. He saved them all the same. By dawn, 75 men had survived because of him. Many said they saw him appear out of the smoke like a ghost, a quiet, steady light in a world gone mad. When his commanding officer asked how he'd done it, Doss simply said, "I just kept praying that God would let me get one more." Days later, during another attack, Doss was hit by a grenade. Shrapnel tore through his legs. He refused evacuation. He bound his own wounds and crawled back toward the front. As he was tending another soldier, a sniper's bullet shattered his arm. He fashioned a splint from a rifle stock and crawled 300 yards to the aid station. Even as medics carried him away, he begged them to treat others first. When he finally reached the hospital, he realized he had lost his Bible, the same one he carried through every battle. Days later, his unit found it on the ridge and returned it to him, muddy, torn, but intact. When the war ended, Desmond Doss returned home a national hero. But he never saw himself that way. In October 1945, President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, the first ever awarded to a conscientious objector. The president told him, "You're the bravest man I've ever met." Doss simply bowed his head and said, "The real heroes didn't make it home." He had saved 75 men at Okinawa, but in his heart he remembered only those he couldn't reach. After the war, Doss returned to Lynchburg. He lived simply farming, raising his family, and speaking occasionally about faith and courage. He suffered from tuberculosis contracted in the Pacific. He lost one lung and half the other. He could barely breathe, but he never complained. He refused fame, refused fortune, and avoided interviews for decades. He said only, "All I ever wanted was to serve my country without hurting anyone." His wife Dorothy once said, "Desmond never preached about his faith. He lived it." In the years that followed, soldiers and medics alike came to study his story. The U.S. Army used his reports and training manuals, a guide to battlefield medicine and courage under fire. At Fort Benning, recruits still learned the Doss method of casualty evacuation, a technique born from one man's endurance on Hacksaw Ridge. When Desmond Doss passed away in 2006 at the age of 87, his funeral was attended by veterans from every branch of service. They came not to mourn, but to honor the man who proved that faith, humility, and mercy could stand taller than any weapon. Today, on the cliffs of Okinawa, the wind still howls through the grass above Maeda Escarpment. The scars of war have faded, but somewhere in that soil lie the echoes of a man's footsteps, a medic who chose compassion over violence and faith over fear. Desmond Doss showed the world that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. He carried no gun, fired no bullet, and yet saved more lives than most armies ever could. He proved that even in war, a man of peace could be a warrior.